In today's episode of Today in World War II, January 6th, a Finnish fighter pilot rolls a lucky seven against the Soviets in the Winter War. The Free French forces venture from neighboring Chad to capture an Italian airfield in Libya. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff decide to let the British into their exclusive club, and the most powerful carrier strike force in world history was formed on this day. Over in Eastern Europe on the Eastern Front, the Red Army crosses the original 1939 Polish border. General Doolittle in England, with the head of the 8th Air Force, orders his fighter pilot chief to get his ass into a fighter and fight. And finally, Finland, now that the war was over, decides to lift the ban on dancing. Let's get started. Okay, so on today's date, January 6, 1940, Finnish Air Force pilot Jorma Sarvanto and his wingman, they shot down seven Soviet bombers in a single engagement. I find this very interesting because if you go in and look at exactly how many aces the Finnish Air Force had against the Soviets, it was interesting. They really made hay against the Soviet Air Force. What I also find interesting, especially in the Winter War, they were they were flying some outdated fighters. I mean, one of the biggest, a lot of these aces reached 20, 30, 50 victory levels with a U.S. cast-off, the Buffalo. Now, the Marines, if you know anything about how the Marines and the Navy work in the U.S., the Marines got all the hand-me-downs from the Navy. So when the Navy had transitioned to F-4F Wildcats, a lot of the Marine air groups still had to fight with Buffaloes, and they still existed after the Pearl Harbor attack. And the most famous case of the Buffalo squadrons basically being wiped out was at Midway. And you would think that the same thing would happen to the Finns, who had these, let's face it, they were pretty obsolete aircraft. But the Soviets at this time didn't exactly have great fighter or bomber planes either. They weren't exactly top level technologically speaking. So the Finns were fortunate that these obsolete aircraft, like say in the Pacific or against the ME-109, if they had to fly against the Germans, they were able to do well against the Soviets. And so I just want to say it wasn't just the Finnish army that was able to give bloody nose after bloody nose after bloody nose against the Soviets. The Finnish Air Force was able to do the same thing, and so this was just an example of that, of Mr. Sarvanto, becoming an ace, six, seven victories in one day against the Soviets. So good for him. Good for you for subscribing to this channel. It's such a simple thing to do. All you have to do is just go down below the screen, hit subscribe, click the bell that says, that notifies you when I drop a video, and that's all you got to do. It's that simple, and it helps me. So I appreciate it. I'm not asking for any money, just subscribe and engage with me. That's all I need. Thanks. All right, so on today's date, December 6, 1941, a Free French force under Lieutenant Colonel Jean-Colin Darnon, and that's a horrible accent. I apologize to anyone who speaks French for that accent. It was inexcusable on my part. Anyway, this Free French force attacked Merzouk airfield in southwest Libya. They were based in Chad. Previously, they had freed the French forces from Vichy, the Fiji regime, and they started attacking Italian and German outposts in all over Africa. In this case, they decided to come in from Chad, which is in the, Chad is below south of Libya, and they came and captured the airfield, and which was great. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Colonel Darnano was killed in the battle, which we salute his service and his sacrifice. And I just want to say one thing, just in passing. The Free French kicked ass in World War II, and the French unfairly get a bad reputation, especially in the U.S., as not being brave fighters. They were pretty brave and they were pretty effective. And I would just say one thing: No country could stand up in 1940 against the German Blitzkrieg. The Brits were able to because they had a channel and they had a strong navy and air force. But when you had a contiguous border with Germany, you were going down. Okay. The Soviets, if they didn't have, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles to trade, land to trade for time, they would have been conquered as well. So let's take it easy on the French, okay? But you can take it easy on me by clicking the like button on this video and leaving a comment. It's all about the algorithm. Everything we do nowadays is about the algorithm. I mean, I'm convinced that my wife has her own algorithm, and it's against me. Okay. But you have to get engagement to grow your channel on YouTube. You have to do what the algorithm wants. In this case, the algorithm wants you to get lots of likes and comments on your content, just like my wife wants me to take out the trash more often. So, you gotta follow what the algorithm wants. Okay, so please do so. Thank you. All right, so on January 6, 1942, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, which was, the Army, the heads of the Army, Navy, Air Force, it had the Marines in there as well. I'm not sure if the Coast Guard was represented or not, but they were. This never existed before World War II. Roosevelt put that into existence when right before World War II started, and so the British had their own chiefs of staff, and so it was decided on a bilateral level between the Brits and the US that they would be a combined chiefs of staff called CCS, and they would be able to better coordinate the strategies moving forward, mostly in Europe, but later in the war in Asia. And it was designed to decide, it was designed to find the best way, the most efficient way to defeat Hitler. Boy, I can't even imagine efficient way to defeat Hitler. That was quite the thing, especially when you had the problem with the Americans being green but a little bit arrogant, and the Brits obviously having experience but maybe a little bit gun shy about, the Americans wanted just to go directly and solve the problem. The Brits kind of want to do a more of a ancillary attacks and so forth because of course they didn't have the manpower and the resources that we had, but we didn't have it yet. It took us like about a year and a half to get everything going, industrially speaking. So, in any case, this was the day this was formed, and it served the Allies very well moving forward. On today's date, the Fast Carrier Task Force was named TF-58, and they made it. They put it under the command of Rear Admiral Mark Mitscher. This was the most powerful carrier strike force in world history. We had all the industrial might of the U.S. was starting to produce these carriers. The original carriers that had gotten sunk, with the exception of the Enterprise, these were the earlier class carriers, and they did a hell of a job keeping the Japanese at bay, taking it to them, and winning the war for all intents and purposes at Midway and in the Solomon Island campaigns, especially in Guadalcanal. But now you had the Essex type class carriers coming out. Six of them were there. They had six light carriers that came out. There was over 700 carrier aircraft that were able to be sent on attacks. They had six modern battleships, not the old World War One era battleships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor. Those battleships couldn't even sail. If they hadn't been sunk, they still wouldn't have come out and fought with the carrier task force because they were too slow. So you had ultra modern, uh, battleships, cruisers. It was by far the most powerful fleet in the world, and the Japanese had no chance. And as the war is moving forward in 44, and of course in the war of 45, this task force was unstoppable. Speaking of unstoppable, on January 6, 1944, the Red Army crossed the original 1939 Polish border, and in their winter offensive that they started a few months ago, they were advancing like you wouldn't believe against the Germans. This was almost a full scale collapse on the German part in the Eastern Front. At their peak, the Red Army was advancing nearly 200 miles in 2 weeks. So this was the colossus that the Germans were now facing, and it all, they invaded. They weren't ready. They were not. Hitler did not realize. Why would he? He was Hitler, a corporal, military genius as a corporal in World War One, that there was no way in the world he was going to be able to beat the Soviets. His whole idea was that it was a rotten society, a rotten government, and that they just kicked the door in within 6 weeks it would collapse on its own. That's a hell of an assumption to make when you're going after one of the largest countries in the world, to assume that they're going to self collapse. Well, they didn't collapse, and they had a lot of help from the Allies with Lend-Lease and supplies that we sent them and trucks that made them very mobile. So, yeah, good job, Hitler. Another great decision there. On January 6, 1944, James Doolittle, of the Doolittle raid fame over Tokyo, they took off against, from the carrier Hornet, to help remind the Japanese that even though they beat us at Pearl Harbor, that we were still there and we were going to fight. Anyway, later in the war, he was named to be the commanding officer of the U.S. 8th Air Force, and he was a little piffed, a little peeved at his fighter chief, William Kepner, because Mr. Kepner, even though he was a fighter chief, he kept focusing on, uh, you know, uh, bomber escort. And fighters, as a general rule, they cannot be tied down somewhere. They need to go, they need to be able to roam. They need to go out and attack. Fighters are aircraft. And so, while it was great they were protecting the bombers to a certain extent, for them to truly realize the ultimate goal of the bombing offensive in the Western Front was they needed to destroy the Luftwaffe and the Luftwaffe fighter force. And the way to do that was to go after them and strafe their airfields and destroy their pilots and so on and so forth. And so Doolittle basically was telling his subordinate there, we want to kill them, go after them. Don't tie your fighters down to the bombers. Let them roam free. And they did. And of course, the results came very quickly, and not in a good way for the Luftwaffe. And finally, a little humorous note here: on January 6, 1945. The war was over between Finland and the Soviet Union. The Finns had pushed the German army out of northern Finland, which was a requirement the Soviets had demanded in the armistice. Finland during the war, I guess for some reason, I don't know why, but they had banned dancing. I mean, they're Lutherans, they're not Baptists. I don't know why they would ban dancing, but they did. Anyway, on today's date, they lifted the ban, so now happy Finns could go out and dance. I lived in Finland for 2 years. I know I speak Finnish very well. And let me just put it this way. The Finns are not the liveliest people when they're not drunk. And, Finns are very taciturn. They're very quiet when they're not drunk, and I love them. They're awesome, but they're not exactly going out to hoedowns a lot. I thought that was interesting that they lifted this dancing ban. I didn't know if it makes that much difference or not to them, but hey, I'm an outsider looking in, but I just thought it was pretty funny. I imagine that the sale of vodka went up for the Finnish men to have the courage to go out there and start dancing and let themselves go, because they're very, like I said, they don't let themselves go unless they got a little alcohol. But when the alcohol is flowing, boy, watch out. They'll kick your ass. Anyway, thanks for tuning in today to this video. I appreciate it. And I look forward to having a video for you tomorrow.